Well, good afternoon. Do you have a good lunch? Yes. All right. Well, I'm excited to get to welcome you to our Studio 43. The goal of our Studio 43 conversations is to highlight issues that are major topics that may live in specialty circles today, but will be headlines tomorrow. In previous forums, we've focused on issues like cybersecurity and changes to our polling science. And today we're going to dig into technology and how technology has changed how we go about our lives, stay connected, and do business. I think we can all agree that technology is very important. As a matter of fact, Americans believe that the biggest advancement in our lives in the past 50 years has been technology, after medicine and health. But look at those numbers. It's not even close. And we know that technology has made our lives more convenient. We can order our food and our shoes and even our medicine, and it shows up right at our doors, and there's very little hassle. Did you know this? Today alone, Uber will be making 23 million rides and deliveries. Think about that. That means in the time it takes for you to enjoy the next 2 conversations, 1 million rides and deliveries will be happening. That's crazy, right? There's so much more. From our computers, we can work from anywhere in the world. We're meeting our significant others online in places like Match.com, and we're connecting with old friends that we haven't seen in years on social media. But like anything, there are 2 sides to this coin. So even though we have all of this wonderful technology that has the potential to connect us together, we are lonelier and more divided than ever. For example, did you know that 1 in 3 Americans report feeling lonely or isolated? And when you look at 18 to 24-year-olds, that number goes up to 61%. So while we have all of these increasing rates of technology and internet usage, we also have increasing rates of loneliness and anxiety. Our 2 panelists today are going to help us navigate through this new reality of connection. And we're going to talk about all of the amazing things that technology can do to get us more connected, as well as the dangers and the unintended consequences that we're faced with today. So let me introduce my 2 panelists to you today. First, we have Mandy Ginsberg. She's the former CEO of Match.com, and she currently advises companies like Uber and ThredUp and Advent International. She's going to share with us her amazing experience of building these digital communities that are actually designed to help people make more meaningful connections in real life. And joining her is Nikki Krishnamurthy. She's the Chief People Officer at Uber. She's been in human resources for 3 decades, and she's going to share her insights on how she's seen technology change the way that we approach work. So, will you help me welcome them to the stage? All right, welcome. All right, well, welcome, ladies, to the Bush Center. And Mandy, let's start with you. How have you seen technology change how we connect?
Before I start, I just wanted to sort of make a point. It's great to be here. I can't believe we're in this incredible city and SMU and then this incredible presidential center. But I will tell you, when it comes to technology, it is changing our lives. We know that. Every single person in the room is using technology on a day-to-day basis. But what you might not have known is that I think a lot of us are from Texas in the room. I know there's people joining us from all over the world, but I grew up in Dallas. And one of the biggest innovations in technology is really the business that I ran for a long time, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that, but it's right in our backyard. And so the point I'm making is that not only is technology impacting millions and millions and millions of people around the world, it's not just coming from Silicon Valley, it's coming right from our backyard here in Texas. So.
Yeah, it's amazing.
One thing I just wanted to start with, based on maybe some gray hair in the room, maybe that dating apps or dating platforms seem unusual or strange for people, but just a show of hands, I'm not going to ask who's on dating apps.
I thought that's where you were going.
No, but a show of hands, who knows someone who has met on a dating app?
Okay.
Okay.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty much almost 100%, maybe 90%. That's actually about the number. So when I started at Match in 2005, 2% of relationships in the US were from dating websites, because there was no such thing as apps. And today, 50% of relationships in the US and Western Europe are from dating platforms, which is pretty profound. And so I would say the world is changing, and it's changing fast over the last 15 years. And although we looked at some of the stats that maybe are the negative implications, and we'll talk about those, I think what is hopeful is that we have the ability, using technology, to change people's lives in a positive way.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, Nikki, what would you add to this?
Yeah, I echo what Mandy just said, though. I feel very honored to be here to have this conversation with all of you and get to meet people. Everybody has such interesting stories. I was actually born in Dallas, so I have never been here since I moved away when I was 2 years old. So I also,
welcome back.
Thank you. Yes, I consider myself an original Texan. So technology is definitely woven into everything that we do. Specifically, Uber even mentioned about the number of rides and deliveries that happen every day. And it's amazing how much technology, specifically for Uber, is around trying to make life easier for people. So it's trying to bring technology, but into the real world. I mean, that is 23 million interactions between people every day just through the use of technology. So we find ourselves in this unique position that a lot of people think of technology as something that is out there, and the technology Uber builds is really thinking about how do you intersect with the real world. It's not just out there somewhere.
Yeah.
So it's amazing.
So it helps smooth the path of getting people together, but that's not always true, right? So I mentioned in my opening, you probably heard, people feel more isolated than ever. So what do you see that's going on?
Well, we are in unique businesses because we are sort of, this is ironic, we actually don't want you to be on our platforms. We want you to click on to get out in the world. So, so for Match and Tinder and all the businesses that I work on, we want you to go out on that coffee date and really get off your devices and fall in love. And with Uber, similar to Uber, we want you to get in the car and get to where you need to go or get the things you need. So our goal is not, unlike social media, is not to keep people on these platforms and keep eyeballs in the platforms, and we don't monetize or make money off of people staying on our platforms and spending hours on platforms. I think what's happening, and we all see the stats, and for those of us who have teenagers, we really feel it, there is too much time being spent on your device like this.
Yeah.
On average, teenagers spend 8 hours a day, which is crazy, on technology. And I think that it's something that this is sort of there's so much efficiency and so much great things that technology can do, but the flip side is the loneliness and isolation. And I think there are things that we can and should do as a society, as parents, as government, but we've got a ways to go, because what I don't think we sort of realize, and it's funny, I've got a daughter who is pre-app, and I've got a daughter who's post-apps, and even sort of watching them.
Pre-app and post-apps, that's a new.
And so, but in 2010, only 5% of teenagers would log in every day to social media apps. By 2014, 80% were logging in and pretty much online all the time, and now those numbers are even higher. So things have shifted so much in terms of teen behavior, and we have to catch up and figure out what should we be doing to be able to curtail some of that behavior that's not always positive.
Yeah. And Nikki, you would think we have all this access to information. When we're on, that's what we see, all this information. It would broaden our perspectives. But that's not what's happening, or at least that's not what it seems like happening. It's narrowing it. So what does that mean? What are you seeing? Why is this creating more isolation?
Yeah, what you say, I think, does happen, meaning with all the access that we have to information through technology, I think the original thinking is that it just gives you such a broad perspective of different ideas. But at least what we experience is that it is such easy to really, though, cut out those perspectives that you don't want to hear. It's very easy to say, that's not somebody that thinks like me, so I just won't listen to that person. And we see it, unfortunately, a decent amount at Uber. When there's anonymity to people and not having to put your name to something, you can see people not have some of those normal courtesies that you have in person. Some of those normal ways you might want to ask a tough question, but you say it respectfully because your name is attached to it and you think about it, that other person is a human. And when it's online, and even worse when you're anonymous online, I think that it can become very, very negative. So it's the dual side of technology. Like, you have access to so much diversity, and we can learn so much through that diversity, but it's also just as easy to shut off that diversity.
Yeah, exactly.
I just wanted to comment. I do think that people have so much ingenuity when it comes to technology, and I'll give one example. And I know Uber, when we talked before, Uber's got some really interesting ways about how people leverage technology for the good. So I was running Match and Tinder, and this was during the protest in Hong Kong. And we saw some really unusual activity happening, which was a little strange. And just for those of you who haven't used Tinder or dating apps, so we're really one-to-one communication. We're not like Twitter or Facebook or Instagram where it's one-to-many. So people are dating and they're communicating one-to-one. Anyway, the app was blowing up in Hong Kong, meaning a lot of activity. And I was like, what the heck is going on? Why are people dating so much in the middle of all these protests? This makes no sense. But what we found is that that users were being very smart about communication and organizing where to go protest by getting on these apps and telling people to get on these apps. And they were using it not to date, but to have one-on-one conversations, like thousands and thousands of them, to mobilize and tell people where to go. So I've been pretty impressed to see how people can use like a basic platform to do something that we didn't certainly intend for it to do. And I think for Uber, there's a lot of really great intention in terms of how Uber has mobilized the platform. And full disclosure, I'm on the Uber board, so I probably know a little bit more about Uber than the average person.
Yes. Yes.
And so, Nikki, have you seen people using Uber in ingenious ways, or are you all using it in ingenious ways?
I would say, you know, Mandy's talking about how people wind up engaging, but Uber definitely tries to do things that are more ingenious in that one of the key things I know I'm very proud of is what we've done in the Ukraine and all of the, not just the free rides that we've provided, but there's transportation needs in the Ukraine that they don't necessarily need drivers for, but they need the application for it. So we designed it for them and are letting them use it for free so that they can move supplies around. They don't need all of our service, but they needed the technology behind it. And I'm very proud of all of that stuff. That's enabling us to really help a community of people that desperately need help. And it's through technology. It's one of the reasons why I love technology. I just think that it has to have, you have to have responsibility with it as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I want to pick up on something you were saying a little earlier about this anonymity at work.
Sure.
So we hear these, at least I'm hearing this great resignation and quiet quitting, and it feels like it's like the managers and CEOs versus the employees. So are you seeing this as well as a chief people officer when it comes to technology? How is this playing in, and what are you seeing?
I think it's shifting right now. I'll answer the question about the great resignation. I don't think many people expected that. I think a lot of people thought that resignations would go down during the pandemic, the idea being that people would get a little more risk adverse. And that's the exact opposite. I think, again, that came from the isolation. People were sitting at home working online, but I think they became more and more isolated. So a way to have something new and do something different is they were all changing jobs. They had the time to think about what did they want to do differently. And I think that that was something that we were dealing with for a good 2.5 years. But right now, in the last, call it 6 to maybe 12 weeks, it's actually the exact opposite that's happening right now. I think the power is shifting from employees to employers because of what's happening with tech companies right now. Our attrition has completely fallen off a cliff.
Yeah.
And so I think a new phase is being written right now. I get a lot of questions about the Great Resignation, and I'm like, that's a little bit of history. It's being shifted right now.
Yeah, and part of that, Mandy, is this remote work versus in-person. What have you seen in the companies you're advising?
Well, young people don't want to come into the office, and their managers and CEOs generally want them to. It's really a struggle. I think there's sort of a few advantages. I mean, one advantage is that, and Nikki and I have this debate, if you look out the next 10 years, I was in roles where I was extremely dependent on very good engineering talent, and you generally found good engineering talent in very small pockets in the country. That's changing. And I think that the more flexibility we give, the better ability for us to recruit and find incredible talent. So I think there's a benefit there. I think the downside is, I mean, think about it, is we all look at our own careers. I just remember my first 5, 10 years, I learned so much from watching my leaders, and I learned what I didn't want to be, I learned what I wanted to be, and I did it because I was sort of over their shoulder, peeking, sitting, listening to meetings or in conversations, even in hallway conversations, having coffee. That is changing, and I think that's the thing that I think the CEOs I work with are the most worried, and I'm on a couple of boards of younger stage companies where they're like, are we gonna get that sort of entrepreneurial spirit and ingenuity, by the way, that's been driving the technology industry in the US, are we gonna lose that? And so I think we've been forcing and trying to figure out carrot or stick for young people, but there has been truly real resistance to people coming into the office. And you can get all the best food in the world and the best snack food in the world, but it's still hard. And we are sort of trying desperately to get people back to the office in a few of the companies I'm working with, and I think the same goes for Uber.
Yeah. Why Mandy said that we have a bit of a debate going on is it goes back to what I just said. I think things are shifting. What Mandy said, I would have agreed with 12 weeks ago, that I think there was a lot more power with the employees, and they were demanding the flexibility that they had become accustomed to during the pandemic. And we were struggling with it, but I think it's changing right now. And if you think about that isolation that we keep going back to, what we see at Uber is that the employees that are the most engaged and the most satisfied and the most productive do come to the office. And we think that it is because of that in-person connection that they have. Yeah. We do know that they need flexibility, not just based on what they say. The most productive employees also have 2 hours of focus time each day. So what we're trying to do at Uber is figure out, based on that data, how do you put that together? How do you allow that flexibility that people are asking for, that we know make you more productive, but acknowledge that isolation feeling that people are having. So that's why, I think Mandy and I are in a debate, just like probably a lot of companies are, is which one is right and which one will actually happen. I honestly don't know. I don't know, but I know what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it, and we're trying to balance both of those things.
I'm so embarrassed. I used to tell people, you want to work from home? You can work from home all you want between midnight and 7 a.m. I don't think it would fly today.
Are there any other sort of struggles you're seeing with technology coming into our workforce and we're just really reliant on it? Or is it more opportunity? Either one of you.
I mean, for me, the thing is, you cannot put the genie back in the bottle. It's gone. And I sort of think about my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, what was the sort of the big, huge shift that happened? And frankly, the mobile device is one of those things that was just, it's so profound in the way that people engage. I mean, we spent so much of our energy at Match Group focusing on young, emerging countries like India, Indonesia, some South Korea, not that it's emerging, but where we actually saw this huge leapfrog where young people they didn't even have desktop, everything is on their device, and so sort of the genie's out. Like there's no way of putting it back in the bottle. I think it's figuring out what are the right work norms, and then also what are the right social norms that it's going to be productive long term. And again, I sort of go back to, because there's a loneliness epidemic, and we didn't talk about it, but when COVID hit, I think that there was a fear like, oh no, no one's going to meet face to face. And by the way, they did, because all young people ignored all the precautions. But I said no one's going to meet. But what ended up happening is people were home, they were lonely, they were stuck at home, and the activity went up just meaningfully on all the apps. And what it sort of tells us is not sort of surprising, is that this is sort of Maslow's hierarchy. We have such a desire and need to be in love and to connect with people. And so we're wired that way, so there was no stopping it. And so I just feel like, given all the things that we are sort of working against, I do feel like we can leverage technology to help with the loneliness, to help support our young teens, to help figure out a way to make people healthier and improve their lives.
Yeah, and it's these social norms, especially at work, that I spend time thinking about. Like, I have all these people staring at me, there's lights in my face, and there was a moment where I thought, where's my phone? right? And our attention spans are shorter, et cetera. So Nikki, I mean, you're in charge of people. How are you seeing this play out? Anything you're doing to sort of work on these social norms and using our mobile devices?
Well, on the social norms, it's one of the reasons we want people back in the office, because we do see that people are more respectful. They care about their colleagues, and I think you lose a bit of that. And employees were telling us that during the pandemic, and we couldn't do anything to help them because we wanted to keep them safe from a health perspective. But we see that when people come in and have a human connection, even if they go away again for a week or 2 weeks, it just creates something very different. We also, we do an all hands every 2 weeks for the employees, and we took away the anonymous questions.
So they were able to type in anonymous questions or
Yeah, they were able to, and there were some nasty questions. You see with that anonymity that people just don't feel like they have to treat the other person like a human in ways that they would never, ever do if it was in person.
Yeah.
And so, so we try big things and small things, and so it's a small thing, but putting your name to your question completely changed the dynamic of the questions. You know, the original intent of anonymity is helping employees feel like they could be safe and they could ask the tough questions without what unintended though happened was that they wound up asking nasty questions sometimes. And so what we found is that we're building a great culture where you have to be respectful, so put your name to it, but you can still ask any hard question. Yeah. And we've been doing that now for a few years, and I think it's working.
Okay, great. Mandy, anything to add?
I mean, I think that like you didn't ask this, but I think when it comes to anonymity, like in dating apps, you really don't know who that person is. Even in dating apps, you put your first name. And what I will tell you is that we see, well, because we have 20 brands or so and 50 million people on these platforms globally, we sort of are a reflection of society. So everything you sort of read in the paper or see out in the world is reflected on our apps. And by the way, people ask me all the time, how do you make sure long-term technology companies are safer? And I said, I don't know if you guys realize there's 2 female executives here. And I was like, you put mothers in the leadership positions, especially mothers who have children, and you want to make sure that these environments are safe for everybody. But what we found using truly technology and AI technology is how do we make sure we keep our platforms safer? Yeah. And so it's not just what happens at work, and we have about 3,000 employees globally, not nearly like a tiny percentage of what Uber has, but what was happening is we had tens of millions of people on these platforms saying pretty horrible things to each other. And I think that even the divisiveness we see in this country and a lot of the sort of name calling or finger pointing that we see, we actually saw seeping in on these dating platforms. And so we went to work, we employed about 50 or so data analysts and AI experts who really identified word choice. There's no naked pictures on any of our platforms. We make sure of it, and we don't have that as policy clearly, but we also make sure that technology is there to protect people. But when there's bad behavior, when there's racism, when there's name calling, when there's inappropriate sexual misconduct or words that are offensive, we actually can spot it almost as quickly as people are typing it. And so that's a little unexpected. I wouldn't have thought, in 2005 when I started, that we need a whole army of people making sure that people are civil, because I don't think they'd be saying this if they were bumping into each other at church or through friends or at a bar. And so that's the big change that we've had to make.
So does that put you in a tricky position of figuring out where that line is of civility? Some things are obvious, you know it when you see it, but was it ever tricky to try to figure out what that is?
I think that yes, and I had, funny enough, a lot of people that we felt that were inappropriate dialogue and banter that we knocked them off the platform, and so we were a little bit conservative, and then they'd be reaching out to me on Instagram and on LinkedIn and on somehow find me to complain and beg to get back on the platforms because they had 2 dates and they didn't know how to get in touch with these people. But look, these are all judgment calls, and I will say that I kind of go back to I as a mom, and I have a daughter who's on these platforms who's 24. I was like, you know what, I'd rather be more conservative and have people get mad at me for being kicked off the platform than not. And so I'd have to beg the mother judgment call, and I was sort of okay doing that, but it is complicated.
It is, and let's keep going on this security question because that's one of the big concerns with technology. So it's threats to your privacy and data. It's security threats. You're meeting, a million rides. You're going to meet a lot of people today. So first of all, what are you seeing companies do to help with some of these security threats? And then just broader, I'd love to hear from all of you on how we should be thinking about this idea of these security privacy threats when it comes to technology. Nikki, do you want to start?
Sure. It goes to that responsibility. When you have the technology, there's all these opportunities, but you have to think of it responsibly. I think companies are taking it more seriously and putting some effort, not just as an afterthought, but in the front of how do you build this technology to be, one, maybe I should start with, I recognize what Mandy said, is that you have to understand that whatever you put out there is a reflection of the society, and so there will be safety issues. And I think that, maybe years ago, people didn't want to accept that, so it was always more of an afterthought. And I think that companies now are more and more saying it has to be a part of the design. How do you make this as safe as possible? Number one. Number two, and when it's not, how can you deal with that? How can you mitigate those things? And I see, because of the time I've been in technology, I see more and more companies think about that, safety by design, as opposed to what is the risk mitigation factors. And I think that's been a very big shift over the last, call it 5 to 15 years, more and more safety by design. Specifically, Uber, one is I think we were pretty revolutionary in that we put out what were the safety incidents, and nobody really had access to know that before. And I think that was pretty bold of us saying, how can we put out there, which a lot of people would say puts us at risk, but if we're going to start to really address these issues, we can't do that without being transparent about what safety incidents happen on our platform. And that meant literally categorizing what are the different types of incidents that you have. If you just think about sexual harassment, there's all different levels of sexual harassment. You can't just bucket it in one thing because somebody touching you inappropriate is very different than somebody saying something to you that just made you slightly uncomfortable. Both are issues. We make sure that we're building technology on auto recordings and stuff like that so that we can go back. But we have to think about privacy as well. How do you keep people safe, have records when something doesn't go well, but also respect people's privacy? And we have to think about each and every one of those things. Uber operates in over 70 countries, and so we also have to think about the local laws. And so sometimes what our philosophy is on something and wanting to keep people safe could actually be something that is not well thought of in that country specifically. So we have to navigate a lot of the things of what is our philosophy about safety. It's actually one of our company values, safety, but it's not always that way in those local countries. Yeah. So it's a lot of complexity to navigate.
Yeah, and thought about that. And you have to think about the cultural norms in each of the countries. So it's great that you guys are doing that. Mandy, what would you add?
Well, you mentioned in the intro that, Uber puts, that's 23 million rides. So think about that. I know there's not one-to-one, but if you have 40 million people that are connecting, and these are complete strangers, and they're connecting when they go from place to place, that is a pretty profound number of people. And on all of our dating apps, millions of people every day go on dates. The challenge that we have with dating apps is that it's not that people are meeting, but it's that they might go on their 5th date or 10th date and something could go wrong and they're off our platforms. Fortunately for platforms like Uber, usually the connection is when the ride is live. But we actually studied a lot of what Uber was doing because this safety report was really pretty instrumental in getting the entire industry to feel comfortable about putting information out about safety. The reality is that bad things happened on all these platforms. I would sit in the worst time in my life was when I would have someone come to me and said, Mandy, there's been a reported rape. What do you want to do? I was like, one is too many. And so there is a lot of things that we had to do as people who are connecting strangers, which is one, making sure that we educated our users. 2, making sure that we put a series of features right inside the apps. And when you put a series of features right inside the apps, including Uber, for those of us who've driven Uber, you open it up and there's a safety feature, and you know that you can push a button to complain about safety issues. You know that there's oftentimes a camera in the car. We didn't have that advantage, but for us, we really try to put the power in front in people to say, if there's ever an issue, let us know when you haven't met someone or once you do, and also making sure that we were committed to really deal with this head on by putting together a safety issue. So we had the head of RAIN, which is the Rape Crisis Hotline that we put on our board, and there's about 10 people from law enforcement to really think through how do we educate and what do we do. And at the end of the day, if you tell bad actors that this is not the platform where you're going to be able to get away with it, they actually get scared and they will go elsewhere to create havoc. And we just wanted to make sure that every single person who came on our platform knew that we had their back and we were focused on this every day.
What Mandy said, I would build on something, and it's slightly different for Uber because we do also have to, we take more conservative approach if we need to, we call it deactivate a driver, if there's any incidences. But when you do that, if you're too conservative, you have to remember that you're affecting somebody's earnings. And so for us, there's this delicate balance of trying to make it as safe as possible, but understand that if you're too conservative, you could be deactivating somebody that's done nothing wrong, and now you're affecting their earnings. So that is something that we're always trying to balance, the fact that when it comes to safety, we definitely want to educate the consumer. Like Mandy said, you can hit 911 from the app, you can share your location from the app, so we've built that for the consumer, but we also have to think about the earners that are driving people around. And because we need safety on both sides, and unfortunately, sometimes it's actually the consumer that is at fault, not the driver.
Yeah, and so when you're thinking about safety and security, you both said you're moms. Mm-hmm. And would you be willing to share your rules with your kids about using technology and the safety and security you put in place for them?
Can I get some advice from people in the audience?
That's what I meant to do.
I just told Mrs. Bush that I have a 14-year-old daughter. I hope she never sees this. I said, this is the worst job because you can't fire them and you can't quit. So, but it's really an ongoing challenge, I think, especially for girls. I think we saw, I can't remember if you showed the data, but girls between 10 and 14 in this country, in the recent study that came out in February, showed that nearly a third of those girls had suicidal thoughts. That's profound and a huge change from 10 years ago. It's really scary stuff. It happens when the girls pull out their apps and see where they didn't get invited over the weekend or at that moment. So this is something that is very much, I wish I could just allow my girls to get apps or phones when they're like 18, but that's also not very practical too. But look, this is sort of, we are that generation where we have to really think through what are the guardrails. And I think it's really interesting, there's legislation that is trying to get passed in Utah that said parents should have to agree to making sure that their children, or that the children should not have privacy when it comes to their parents. So they have to make decisions about their children's usage of apps. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think a lot of parents out there, they don't even know what Snapchat is. And so they should be more aware and be more involved and have the ability to, to censor and allow their kids to have these technology or these applications.
Okay. Nikki, anything to add?
So it's an active conversation. I actually think that I was much better pre-pandemic. I think it became challenging during the pandemic because what is there to do? You're locking your kids in the house. School somewhat fell apart, so there wasn't very much focus and those types of things. And yet now I'm trying to slowly pull some of that control back. So it's an active conversation. Yeah. I have a 17-year-old boy, a 15-year-old boy, and a 13-year-old girl. And so all different phases as well. It's harder with the 17-year-old because he's about to go to college. So how much can I control what he does? But he's probably also the best of the three because he was older when the pandemic hit. So I think that he had already not been able to be on devices as much.
Oh, yeah.
So that's what I meant is I definitely messed up a bunch during the pandemic. I definitely
I think we all did,
yeah.
So you're good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right, and so interestingly, I think I'm hearing you say there's these responsibilities of the technology companies, and you outlined some of them, and then there's these responsibilities of individuals, right? So can you talk about that balance of if we're gonna keep tech safe, what are the main responsibilities on both sides? Either one of you, go for it.
Look, I think that we now know a lot more in terms of mental health and what these devices are addictive. I mean, for those of you who I can see sort of looking down, we're all addicted to our devices, including email. And so when we get the dopamine hits, believe me, it's happening to our kids a lot more. And so I think that we have a real epidemic. We talked about the mental health this morning, about what that means. It's starting young and younger. And so it's really trying to educate ourselves and making sure that technology companies have responsibility. I will just tell you, and not to sort of point out the big technology companies, but people who run technology, Apple knows who's on their platforms. They know how old they are, they know what they're doing. And so it's not just us, meaning parents and society and government, but I do think that technology companies do have a responsibility because they know more about you than you probably know about yourself, certainly more than you know about your own children and what they're doing. And they have the ability to curtail bad behavior. And I feel like we have to, as a society, hold them accountable to those norms too.
Yeah, wow, what you just said something. They know you better and your children than you probably do because of all the data we have, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Nikki?
I would agree with everything Mandy said. I would say, I'll give the opposite side though, is that I think that as a society and as individuals, we can't just rely on the companies to do it. I think that if we do, we're asking somebody else to take control of our lives and make those social norms or those standards for us. I think, as your question inferred, I think it's a two-way street. And I think one, we can keep demanding that tech companies take it seriously and think about how to design differently. But I think we also have to set the boundaries as well. What do we think as a society and as individuals is appropriate and what's not? I don't like the idea of giving somebody else control and power over what do I think is the right way to live.
Right.
And we see with China too. I mean, they're really trying to curtail behavior for gaming in the country. And so do we really want to go down that path? I don't think so, but we just have to figure out what are those standards and norms because spending 8-10 hours a day on devices is probably not healthy. And I think that competitive gap that we talked about in education and the lack of reading is going to get worse the longer this goes on.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, it's not all doom and gloom though. So let's end on a positive note. Tell me some amazing things that technology is doing for us. Nikki, do you want to start?
Sure. I think it's ironic that we didn't talk about it right now, but all the stuff with ChatGPT and AI. I mean, it's amazing and it's happening right now so fast. And of course, it's scaring people, but on the positive side, I think that if we think about how can we use it to solve problems that we've never been able to solve before, I think AI has tremendous power, but it will require us to think about how we want to apply it and what are those standards by which it's used for good rather than evil. But I'm super excited about ChatGPT.
That's a great segue because you're going to learn more about that in the next panel. Mandy, what would you add?
Okay, so I have two things. I mean, the things that motivate me the most and why I really believe in like this big marketplace in the gig economy and why I joined the board of Uber is because millions and millions and millions and millions of people are educating their children, paying rent, making a living using these platforms in a way that they never could have and have the flexibility that they never had before. So to me, the fact that there are tens of million people out there that are actually making a living through the gig economy and technology is really cool and profound. And then the last thing I'll say, which let's just end on a high. So when I was running Match Group for a long time, just right across the street, every day I would get dozens and dozens of wedding invitations. And I got the funniest letter. It was a really long letter. And it says, it was like, "Dear Miss Ginsberg, I am very unhappy with you right now." And I was like, oh God, where is this going? And it was a man who all three of his daughters who worked, had a salon together. They all three got on Match.com at the time, and they all three found partners and got engaged. And he had to pay for 3 weddings at the same time. And he asked if I wanted to lessen the load. He's like, we can sponsor, Match can sponsor these weddings. But he did say that these women's lives, his daughters' lives were changed because they never would have met their partners and loved their lives had it not been for technology and these platforms. So I think there's a lot of good hope, love, and opportunity in the world to make people's lives better.
What a wonderful story
Yeah.
to end on. So you heard it here. The genie's out of the bottle. Technology's here. We have a responsibility. Technology companies have a responsibility. But look at the amazing things that can happen if we can harness this power for good. Will you join me in thanking our panelists today for this great conversation?